So you're about to watch interview with an interesting guy, Rob. I asked Rob if he'd be willing to do an interview because I think he has a really interesting story that a lot of people can relate to and will help a lot of people in the sense of he had been kind of grinding it out in the job search and had made it to a bunch of job interviews, but never made it to the goal line, if you will. Um, and was really feeling kind of demoralized. And 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 so if you're in the middle of a job search and you're feeling that way, I think hopefully Rob's story will give you some hope. Also, though, his story is a great example of taking about 2.5 decades worth of various jobs and career changes and pulling them together into a unified message and sense of what he has to offer and the difference that that made. The other piece, so he'll kind of walk you through his story. The other piece that we hit on that I hopefully you'll find useful near the end is around storytelling in the job interview. Rob's a great storyteller, and so it was fun to kind of riff together about what makes good storytelling in a job interview. And one little clarification. When you get to that point in the interview, Rob mentions something about how our work together also expanded his taste in music. And it's funny when he said that, I didn't know what he was talking about. And after the interview, I asked him, I'd forgotten that I had recommended a YouTube video about this rather unusual singer named Aurora. And it was, I heard about her from a couple of different YouTube channels on Myers-Briggs typology. And these different Myers-Briggs fans and specialists were talking about her as sort of an archetypal INFP who is willing to really bring her gifts to the world. And Rob's an INFP as I am. So I thought he'd get into it. And she has, so she's a musician, also a visual artist too. So that's what he's talking about. So expanding your music taste is not necessarily a part of your job search. The other point, though, why I'm kind of going into a little detail about that is even though she's very unusual and the video explorations were on INFPs, it's just in general a great story to check out if you're interested in and maybe being more bold in owning your uniqueness and your unique gifts and bringing those to the world. So when you hear Rob talk about that, that's what it's about, Aurora. So enough of the preamble. Let's get into the interview. All right. So first off, thanks for being willing to do the interview.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. So how about if you just kind of walk us through your journey of like the early part of job search, some of the challenges, some of the lessons learned, et cetera, and then we'll just go from there.
Sure. So as I was self-employed at the time and in a new career, a late change, a third career and a late life change, gone back to school for also a third time and decided to chase a passion. And unfortunately, sometimes world circumstances change what you're able to do and not able to do. So the pandemic certainly shifted how I could engage with the world and what I want to do as a photographer and documentary filmmaker. And got to the realization that I couldn't just do that, that I needed to have some additional income to keep things moving along. And went through I guess going through my finances and looking at what do I really need? How much do I need to bring in to fill the coffers so I can continue doing what I love to do? And did that calculus and started pursuing some part-time jobs that would really be low stress so that I could fill the bank account and just keep doing what I love and staying in the nonprofit world. That didn't pan out, oddly enough. With all the experience I had, there were no takers. And it was hard to come to grips with that, knowing what I was bringing to the table, and an organization that might need a great deal of support or some of the skill sets that I have were not interested because I'm assuming it did not line up with the basic expectations they had of the position. So that happened a number of times, and I missed out on a lot of things that I really wanted to do and was excited about, but was very nervous about doing as well. I'm not sure if I had the skill set. And as that happened, no exaggeration, 10, 11, 12 times, things weren't coming together. I had to do a reassess and think, okay, maybe you're not bringing to the table what they're looking for, or you're presenting yourself in a way that doesn't really match up with what they're looking for. Maybe there's some sort of expression that you're giving saying that I'm more concerned about taking this job than I thought, or I'm not as talented as I thought. So I had to spend some time thinking about, with the research that I did with you, about myself and thinking, what's the best fit for me, in changing the scope of how I was looking for work and what would be fulfilling to me. And I think that led me to understand that I could broaden what I was looking for and tap into some things I didn't realize were more fulfilling for me than I thought. That there was greater value in some other things I had done historically in my profession, and bring those back into the fold and start sending some applications and messages out in the world and see if I could snag something there.
And do you mind going into some particulars? Like, what were some of those skills or experiences that you're like, wow, I could capitalize on that and would enjoy capitalizing on it?
Problem solving. I knew that here's what we are up against, here's our challenge, or here's the direction we want to go, and how do we meander our way through this problem solving to get to where we want to be, and what talent do we have within an organization that we can leverage and get there a little quicker or more cleanly in the end. And I think that came from my business background, and came from my background in education, came from my background as a business owner. I started to realize that rather than trying to shoot for one of those three, that I needed to package all three of them together as a very special offering that I had that very few people could present to an organization. So I changed the way I was leveraging what I do. Instead of focusing on what I've done in business and what I've done in education for different jobs, I started to round that out and say, here's all the things I've done, and you probably don't have a candidate that's like this. And I think that's where things shifted in my brain.
I love that. So sort of synthesizing all those things to something else, almost like I'm thinking like a unicorn, as opposed to just one of many.
That's what I hoped. That was the hope. The outfit didn't fit quite as well as I'd liked, but every interview I walked in wearing it and thought, I'm your unicorn.
I love it. And what about, not to kind of go back to the dreary part of the job search, although I'm about to, anything that you want to say because I remember you're sharing about, shooting for jobs that you were really overqualified for, and then not even getting those, and like, what is wrong with me? What like words of advice or encouragement do you have for somebody who might be in that place?
when you said encouragement, I don't even know if I could name encouragement in that time of my life. That's why I contacted you. There was not a word of encouragement I could summons within me, because I felt like I can't even do this. Is this where it's come, that I'm not even capable, or someone doesn't think I'm capable of doing this? So it was not only a huge drain on me emotionally and psychologically, but a very large drain on family and lifestyle. It's not only hard when you're in the interview and in the process, it's hard when you go to the kitchen. It's hard when you're cooking dinner. It's hard when you're sitting on the couch, because that all sits there like a white elephant in the room, knowing that you haven't found something. And there's a heavy weight there for sure. So the encouragement probably came from, first, the people around me certainly supporting me and say, you have a lot of talent. Choosing to stop pushing back on you and going to figure out who I am as a person, and sending out assessments to my peers and my supervisors and asking them what I'm good at, and letting go of who I think I am, and let the rest of the world explain to me what they've seen in me. And that's I think what I grabbed onto and said, okay, now I've redefined myself through the eyes of others, and I can marshal the forces to keep moving on. But I honestly have to say, it was not what I found within myself. It's what I found other people saw within me. So the advice of going out and asking for the opinion of others was a game changer for me.
That's neat. That's cool. Thank you for sharing that. And yeah, so for the viewer, that's I think the official name of it is the best self exercise. And it's one of the questions is, when have you seen me at my best, and why was that me at my best? And that's so neat to hear what a game changer that was. And I don't know about you, but when I did it was like years ago. Every now and then I'll still like go back and read like I have it in a Word document now. It's really encouraging.
Yes. Yep, it is. And encouraging, and also, and not encouraging. It's sometimes a little thump on the nose that you're behaving like that again. I sent it out to the people that are most honest to me, and they reminded me. So when I do that, I want to feel good about me and read some nice things. You have to remember that there's also, if you've chosen well, there's those honest moments where you get that thump on the nose, like, oh yeah, I also behave like that. And you have to take that into account.
Oh, so you sort of improvised on it. Did you do like, when have you seen me at my worst, or like?
Well, no, it was that, when have you?
What's that? What is there something I don't know about myself that you think I should? That one? Yeah.
Exactly. And I did know, I just didn't acknowledge it. And I chose to focus on the things I did so well, and thought that the things I didn't do well were more character flaws. And they're really just things I just don't do well. It's not like I'm not a bad person because I don't do them well. It's just not me. And I had to acknowledge that and say, okay, so I can avoid this, but focus on this, and make sure if I end up in that spot, I need to make sure I wrap around the resources and awareness that I'm in that spot, and do it well rather than letting it ride.
Man, that's a good point. It makes me think of like with StrengthsFinder or Clifton Strengths Assessment, the full one, knowing what your bottom 10 strengths are to like avoid like the plague positions that involve that.
Right.
Is there like a quote weakness that somebody gave you feedback on that you're willing to share, just so the viewer can have a specific example of like, right, that's not a strong suit of mine. Don't do something that relies heavily on that. Is there something that's...
This might be a shocker to you after all of our conversations, but the common theme was, you keep trying to reinvent yourself to be something different and better, and you don't realize how talented and great you are already. So I hope, Rob, I'm paraphrasing, I hope someday you come to the realization that you bring so much to the table and stop trying to be something different. That was a big eye opener, because I do college 3 times, 3 or 4 careers. I'm continuing to try and reinvent myself. And it was nice to hear that you've already been great at what you've done. And I love watching you change. I'm waiting for you to land on knowing that you are great at whatever you do. And that's the baseline.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was from a dear friend who has worked for me and been a peer. And that was really, really wonderful to hear from somebody who has been a direct report off to my side, solving problems with me. And then today, someone who's fully capable as a friend to just tell me how it is. And to hear that from him was outstanding.
Neat.
Yeah.
So what in getting the job that you have now, any takeaways for viewers in terms of what made that work well, whether it was the job or anything, especially the job interview, but anything?
Yeah, there's a couple things that we worked on a job interview that I think were really interesting for me, and I hadn't shared with you yet since the last time we talked. But I fell in love with your recommendation. It was always my parting question, because it can be hard to know about, hard to develop good questions for the interviewer at the end, to make sure that this is not just your generic question. It's thoughtful, and you're concerned. And the recommendation you had about how will you know in a year that I've been successful? What are the metrics that you'll use? What's the point in which I arrive in a year that you'll say, Rob was a good hire? And I love that. And I wish people would have asked me that in all the times I've been interviewing. What I found was interesting in the time I spent in the nonprofit world, interviewing in the nonprofit world, and I'm not knocking that world, but it is less defined in those metrics than the for-profit world. And I often found that when I asked that question, it came across as more accusatory of their systems and routines than it did a curiousness. It sounded more like, so how will I know I'm going to get a raise? And I got a lot of brushback and like, whoa. And it was more defensive in the response than it was, which I found very interesting. And I took note of it and couldn't quite place where it was. But for me, it was important. I really did want to know, how am I going to be successful? And as much as I love the idea of being passionate and really digging in, that couldn't be my answer for that question. I really needed to know. So that when I got this job, when I asked that question, there was a very specific answer for it. So I rested on that. I came to that point where I wondered in the interview process, am I being shallow and not wanting to go into nonprofits and wanting to go into business? But I realized it was more of landing in a place that could give me the feedback that I personally needed to have, so I knew I was successful. Not that I didn't want to do the hard things and work in the nonprofit world again, but for me at this point in my life, I needed to know, where do I stand? How am I doing? And how are you measuring that so that I can move forward and be successful? So I learned that through the interviewing process. But also through that, it also dovetailed with the fact that my comfort level increased immensely once I found the job that I really should be applying for. When I was interviewing in the other positions, they were on the very edge of my experience and talents. I was really pushing the answers beyond what I was comfortable with being able to say I could do. So I think they, not only am I glad that I didn't get the jobs, but I think they made a good choice in hiring other people. But when I went to this last interview where I got the job, I walked in as if I was going into my closet to pick out an outfit. It was, I know the clothes, I know what the pants are, the shirt, the socks, I know what I have. And it was such a relief to go into that and know that I could handle whatever it was that they threw at me, because I had found the right spot to be presenting myself. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. And actually, I'd love to, if we could explore some of the sort of like particularities or particulars rather of this. So can you, if you could, so it's director of operations is your job? Is that the title?
Operations manager.
I'm sorry, operations
From
manager.
your lips to God's ears, director of operations would be outstanding, but let's slow things down. It's only been a few weeks.
There we go. I love it. So operations manager.
Yeah.
Can you sort of like connect the dots? Because I could see where your story could be really inspiring to people who have like an eclectic background and like, what do I do with all this? Can you sort of connect the dots of your responsibilities and the skills required, and then how that filters out to the various gigs you've had?
Yeah, absolutely. So I came out of college, living in a tent selling shoes in Bar Harbor, Maine. Not glamorous, but it led me to, after a handful of steps, I'll accelerate the process, but that experience led me to an operations job for a very large, high-end retail clothing company. And that taught me in my late 20s and early 30s how to create workflow, how to figure things out. And there was no job description for it, for what I was doing in that particular store. And then I got connected with more things in terms of hiring and scheduling and in the software that was, as things were developing in the 90s, computers were changing. And so being a part of that and realizing this really works for me. And then I went to the company that I'm working for now, and spent a few years that same thing. I jumped in and managing a program. How does the product get from here to there, and how's it being decorated and then sent out? And that just really, really fit for me. And I spent about six weeks in that job before I ended up being promoted to bring in this other company, to buy this company, help them buy this company and move it from New York City to Lewiston, Maine, and change their whole workflow and fit it into how this company works. And what an eye-opener to manage that many people in the transition of a multi-million-dollar business into a multi-million-dollar business and make it all work. So throwing myself, I guess, into the fire repeatedly and knowing that the more I do this, the more I'll learn. So I was on one side of the business, on the distributor side of the business, and decided to grow on the supplier side of the business and spent a couple of years there. And unfortunately, that business closed up, and I'd always wanted to teach. And because that's what I think the best part of being in management and having people, because I can't do most things well, but what I can do is hire people that do it better than me and surround myself with that. So I thought that's really what I do, is I teach people how to make me look good and do and meet the expectations we have for growth in the company and the well-being of our employees. So I decided maybe education is a place I need to be, and spent in the management level. I actually started out as a substitute teacher and then jumped from substituting to management, which makes sense that every teacher should go from substitute to supervisor and just skip the whole classroom thing. It's so much better. So I made that leap and spent some years in supervision and education, and then went to the classroom. And those are some of the richest years of my life, is the 8 years I spent in 5th grade teaching. But also tacked onto that, my wife and I owned a brick and mortar storefront as well. My wife was doing a lot of nonprofit work and then went back to school for her career as a therapist. So we were always redefining and changing ourselves. And I think that's what has that we just love that feeling of learning more and doing things differently and then building upon that wave. So I think going back to this organization that I'm working for now, it was the crescendo, I guess, of I think I've pulled together as much as I can. I don't think I can diversify myself anymore. It's now time to find that job that fits all that I packaged up. And that's what I put on the platter to them and said, here's what I've got. Um, and it's as unique as I think you could almost find. Um, and here's where I am.
Neat. Um, how did you you talk about package it up? How did you like frame the value of your teaching experience, your store, owning a brick and mortar store, and maybe even the artistic side of you? I don't know if you included that.
Oh, that's right. I totally skipped that. Yes. So one of the other things I did, I apologize, that I went back to school to be a photographer and documentary filmmaker and spent 3 years trying to make that happen through the pandemic. And that was a big lesson for me. And how I packaged it, I think what helped me in this particular job is that I also knew the industry because I had spent 5 years in it. So I had a working knowledge. Of course, things change, but the basics of take this thing, do this, and then send it to somebody else still existed. But the nuances of it, I understood, and I understood the culture of the organization. I think doing the research and myself, and I spent a lot of time talking to people that were still working in the organization and trying to understand how much has shifted and changed so that I could make sure that the culture that I left was similar enough that I could talk about it and what changes have happened so that I could speak to those as well. And then knowing enough information that I could take the toughest customer or sales rep incidents that they could have, and I could tell the story about how I would handle that situation or that order or whatever it was. And here's the skill sets that I have that walk me through this. Here's how I would handle your staff because I have done. These are the things I've done in my prior careers. I'll give you an example of how I've walked this employee or this student or this parent through the process of going from point A to point B. And that's how I would manage myself working with your customer, your sales rep, or your employee. And I think that's because I could speak from a point of honesty because I had done it, that it felt so much more comfortable than I think I would. Here's how I would probably do it. It felt more wholesome and honest that I know I can because I have, and this is how I would do it.
And can you give an example? And if you can't, that's fine. But one of the things I'm thinking about so in your situation, you did have industry knowledge. So it wasn't like you were a pilot trying to become an operations manager, but that was a long time ago. And then you had these other careers, jobs, positions, gigs in the meantime. And so one of the things, if you remember us talking about, is that whole idea in the interview that comes from marketing. It's like, how can you be the wizard? Like the person has this unique proprietary knowledge that the other applicants don't have. And sort of cousin to that, how can you be fascinating in your answers, in your stories? And I'm curious, can you give an example of how you either drew on your teaching, being a store owner or photography / documentary filmmaker experience to sort of jazz up the fascination factor?
Specific examples might be hard. Let me think. In relation to the specific job or over
Yeah.
the...
Or It could be, because that's kind of a tough question out of the blue. Any of the jobs interviews
I
that you
think
did.
so. Actually, I got one. So when I worked for the organization, this organization, and I do not have permission to share the name, so I don't feel comfortable saying who it is. So it's not the firm, like it is a real company that exists. When I worked for this company prior, I was asked in terms of my operations and how I was able. So the woman who was hiring the vice president who was hiring me knew that I worked for the company, and she and I did not work together directly. She actually was one of the people when I was hired, gave me my little training in her department. So that's how we know each other. We spent about 45 minutes together, and then we passed each other in the cafeteria. So, but we knew who each other were. So I told her the story about this other company that we had purchased out of New York City that I mentioned earlier, and what that entailed. It wasn't just a pick up all the stuff in the cabinets, the filing cabinets and the computers, put them on a truck and then bring it up. It was weeks in New York City and so forth. But the part that I thought was most interesting, and I tried to explain to her, and I did explain to her, is this is what operations to me is, and the level that I'll go to. We had to move that company to Maine, and we had to be there first and spend time working with these sales reps in New York City that were A, losing their jobs, or B, were moving to the state of Maine from New York City into bear country, what they saw as bear country, and they were very unsettled in what they were doing. And C, we were going to change how they operated. You're not going to enter orders this way anymore. You're going to have to do this. You're going to answer this person. You're going to have to make sure you got this commission rate. So their whole world was upside down. On top of moving everything from the third floor and packing it up, we had to spend a week there with our reps sitting next to them. And it was a smoke-free environment. So half their staff was smoking in small cubicles and filling the place up. It smelled like an ashtray. And that was not, they were not used to that. But the most interesting part is packing up a bunch of people from Central Maine onto a 12-passenger bus, a van, and driving into New York City. And many of them have never left the state of Maine. And that trip and going across the Washington Bridge and having a truck rub up against the side of our van on the highway in Connecticut and telling that story of, this is what I did as an operations manager to move what was at that time the most profitable division of this company back to Maine and turn it into something. It wasn't about pack it up and move the computers. There were humans involved and their lives involved, their experiences involved. And how do you make sure that everybody feels safe, whether they're leaving the company, staying with the company, or learning or having a new experience? Just going to New York City and having dinner was huge for some of these people. And how do you manage that process was a massive education for me. And that I could draw upon that. And she was not even aware, even as a vice president, she was not aware that that's what we had to do to make this division happen. So I think telling that story to its granular level raised my abilities as an operations manager. She knew it wasn't about pushing paper. It was about making sure human beings were seen and valued.
I love it. I think this will be a great place to wind up. I not right at this moment, but on storytelling, because I know it's a mutual love of ours. And I love that you said, I jotted that down, about telling it at a granular level. And so just like, it's always fun to listen to a good story, or somebody tells a good story or tells a story well. and just the image of the truck rubbing up against the van, that's an example that, sometimes I'll say to clients, I'm sure I didn't have to say it to you, there's a difference between details that bog down a story.
Yes.
Like if a couple's like, yeah, that happened last Thursday. And like, no, honey, that was when was it Wednesday? Or, that sort of thing.
Yes.
That kind of, yeah, that
Yes.
bogs it down. But the
Yes.
kind of sensory detail, like you just described, or the office smelling like an ashtray, those are the little details that really
Yeah.
make your story come alive. And so I'm just if you would, like, anything you want to say to viewers in terms of storytelling so they really wow.
I think you hit on it about, because nothing frustrates me more than sitting with a couple trying to decide, like exactly what you said. What week or what night was it we went out with Judy and Bill? That really has nothing to do with the story at all. Just let's get to the punchline. And that's exactly what I thought. As I was telling you, I was already filtering, because I was thinking, should I tell them that it was this person that was sitting next to me who saw it? No, because what happens is if you leave it, I guess you might not even call it the granular level. It's almost the pebble level, because you want them to think about, ask the question about the granular level. So you're going to leave it at the pebular level, I guess, if that's a word. And then they ask a granular question about, whoa, 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 back up. A semi truck rubbed against your van? That's what you want. You want to leave them with the ask more, the walking out of the movie theater with, how did that happen? Is there going to be a sequel? You want that bait to be left behind. So as I have those conversations, I want them to be broad so that it gives them a chance to dig in deeper. And then I know what they're curious about and what I might talk more about, or there's no interest at all. And thank God I didn't tell that story more deeply, because they're already done with me and I'm moving on, and I'm just creating a bigger crevice that I can't dig myself out of. So it's self-serving as well.
So when you use the movie analogy, it made me think about, and if there's anything you want to riff on about this, one of the things that I encourage people to do when they're telling stories is, how can I add some drama to it? And not like silly drama, but make, have some suspense, have some conflict. So they do want to know, like, ooh, what happens next? And
Yep.
anything, especially with filmmaking background and everything, anything you want to say about that?
It would definitely be worthwhile to take a look at. It's a very simple look at what a traditional story arc looks like. And for sure, you're going to go back to your high school writing class or elementary school, where they said, here's the story arc, here's how it goes. And it's really, it can be a 15-minute story, a 5-minute story. It can be a 1 hour, 3 hour epic film. It's the same story arc, maybe multiple ones that lay over each other, but there's really that same gradual rise and that fall. And that's where you leave it with that. Don't talk for a while and just let it sit and wait for that question to come. Like, yeah, that really did happen. And I think following that simple research on what a story arc looks like, and see what your best stories about what you do, that not prefabricated, but certainly understand that these are the things that are important that I've done in my career, and how can I explain them in a story arc that leaves them wanting to ask me a second, third, or fourth question to elaborate. And one answer can sometimes cover 2 or 3 questions that they have. So you're really eliminating the number of questions you need to answer, because you're telling a better story. And then they don't have to come back at you with more. And many times I've had them say, well, I guess you've kind of covered that. You've kind of covered that. I guess you covered that, just by making sure that it was a thorough and open-ended story that they can dip themselves into, and not ask the question they intended, but a new one that they find more interesting.
All right. So last question, and it's not a original one. Is there anything that I didn't ask you that you'd like me to ask you, or any closing thoughts that we haven't touched on that you'd like to?
Yeah, if and I highly recommend it, if you choose to use David and his services as a client. My biggest mistake, and it only lasted for a week because I knew I was being a knucklehead. I highly recommend you go through the process of doing the self-assessments. As much as you might feel that it's silly and not productive, the more you sit on it and look at it and be honest with yourself, the bigger tool that it is. And would I have gotten a job sooner if I had not wasted those 2 weeks? Probably not. But I apologize to myself for not taking advantage of it early. And it really, as soon as I opened up to that, it really changed how I thought about myself and how I went about looking for opportunities for employment, and feeling fulfilled by what I'm doing, which is important to me, and changed my music taste. Thank you very much, David.
That's great. Thanks. So thank you very much. Really appreciate this. And this was fun.
Thank you. It was. I appreciate that you chose to talk to me about my experience. It creates value in how we work together, and makes me feel stronger about the effort that I put into the process with you.